good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Erin Romanchuk. I'm the Director of Partnerships for the Energy Futures Lab. I would like to start our afternoon off together by recognizing those who provided stewardship of the land that we find ourselves on today. I invite you to also consider the land that you are joining us from as I acknowledge where I am. So today I'm joining you from the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. This includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, including Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina and the Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. As we are about to enter into a conversation about our shared future, it is important to recognize how past actions have affected us as a society today, and to carefully consider how the actions we take today are going to shape our future. In the shared vision that was created by the EFL fellows and team, we envision Albertans and Canadians to be leaders in energy-based partnerships towards reconciliation with Indigenous peoples of Canada. And as we shape and take action, it is while meaningfully and continuously moving toward reconciliation. Thank you. With that, I welcome you. I'm so pleased to be joined by yourselves as well as our panelists and my colleagues who are on the call today. I'm going to set up the next 90 minutes. I'll only take about 3 minutes to get us there, and then I'll turn it over to the moderator and the panelists. So on this platform, we have a Q&A function. So please type into that at any time your questions, and also upvote any questions you'd like to see answered, as we will protect some time at the end for our panelists to field those questions. Of course, we'll start off with a few of our own. So before I hand the screen over to our moderator, I would like to briefly share with those of you who might not know much about the Energy Futures Lab what we are. The EFL is often referred to as bridge builders, so building a bridge between the current energy system and the energy system of the future. Essentially, we are a coalition of innovators and organizations working together to advance solutions that builds on the energy sector's current strengths to create that future energy system. And if you're wondering what that future energy system is, we do have a shared vision of what that looks like. And really all of the work that we do and have done to date is in service of achieving that vision. So at a very high level, I want to share with you the 5 bullet points that really exemplify what we picture for 2050. So this was created, I will also mention, 6 years ago by the Fellowship and the EFL. And so in the future energy system, we have reliable and affordable energy meeting the needs of all people. It is a net zero system. It means Albertans are leaders in energy-based partnerships towards reconciliation. It's inclusive and equitable, and it's a continued source of economic prosperity for the province and country. So the EFL has been working to align stakeholders around this vision and advancing initiatives in this direction since 2015 by applying its unique social innovation approach. And what I mean by social innovation is that we focus on the non-technical barriers to the adoption of technology and innovation. So this could be many things depending on where the barriers are. For example, policies or a shift in the public narrative, or financing, which is what we'll dive into now as we explore financing for future fit hydrocarbons in the energy transition. So with that, I do invite my colleague, Karen Perla, to take over the mic as our moderator for the day, and I will pop back on the end with a poll question. So over to you, Karen. Thanks again.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you for that introduction. Let me start again by extending a very warm welcome to our awesome panelists and to everyone joining us virtually. I doubt anyone would disagree that we are truly living in interesting and volatile times for our energy economies. As oil and gas prices continue to rise, so do net zero and climate commitments. As the world takes steps to adopt new energy sources, the security of those sources and the security that those sources can provide remains elusive. And with that, continued questions about what comes next, what comes after the commitments, and what will be in and out of our energy future. So again, my name is Karen Perla. I am the director of the Energy Futures Policy Collaborative. The collaborative is a multi-organization effort stewarded by the EFL. It brings together perspectives from inside and outside of Alberta to explore what will define the next frontier of oil and gas and the role that public policy can and must play in attracting investment into these sectors. Key to this work, and perhaps most telling of the need for change, has really been that growing pressure from financial circles for governments and industry to take additional action on climate. And while there is clearly a broad spectrum of investors in the energy system, the number of climate concerned investors continues to grow. So enter what we call future fit hydrocarbons, a concept that we feel captures how oil and gas assets, from the feedstocks to the geography, to the infrastructure, to the expertise that's been built up around these sectors, how these assets can be leveraged to develop new commodities, technologies, and materials that will be really key staples of energy economies going forward as climate becomes much more of a central driving issue. So when I say future fit hydrocarbons, think carbon capture and utilization and storage, think bitumen beyond combustion, battery materials, hydrogen, just to name a few of what can be made from the assets that we already have. So future fit hydrocarbons for us is really a way to name the elephant in the room, that there are multiple opportunities for the oil and gas sector to bridge to a net zero target, multiple ways to drive value in the transition, and that this is a significant opportunity for Canada and Alberta in particular. And indeed, all of these opportunities are projected to be billion-dollar markets. And because we're building something from something, there's a certain stability in that. But, and it's a big but, to unlock these opportunities, the money needs to flow into these projects. So this means investors need to see value in these opportunities, companies need to be willing to pivot and go there, and policy needs to open doors for players, not close them. So very appropriate that we have the opportunity to hear from a very exceptional group of individuals and panelists who all bring immense experience into this conversation, and no doubt diverse views on the opportunity that the combination of energy transition and traditional fuels may bring or may not bring. So obviously, several minds as to whether climate concerned investment will fundamentally disrupt oil and gas. So to start today's main event, and what I anticipate will be a very lively conversation, I'd like to introduce each panelist and then invite them to introduce themselves by just giving us their pulse check opinion on that very question. So I'll start by introducing Chad Park. Chad Park is Vice President of Sustainability and Citizenship with the Cooperators. In this role, he leads the cooperative's efforts to embed and integrate sustainability principles throughout the organization. This includes in its investment strategy and underwriting practices. Chad was also the founding director of the Energy Futures Lab, executive director of the Natural Step Canada, and a founding board member for the Future Fit Foundation in the UK. So Chad, pleasure to have you with us today for this lively conversation. Clearly, there is a broad spectrum of investors out there, and companies still have access to financing. So as an investor yourself, I just want to know, how serious are these investors who are making net zero and climate commitments? And so when I ask that, I'm really asking, when push comes to shove, will these climate commitments really shape investment decisions around hydrocarbon development? What's your 1 minute pulse check on that?
Okay, thanks, Karen. I mean, my short answer is very serious. I think actually that's probably the key point that should be made right out of the start from my perspective is, you know, you're right. We're hearing, you and Aaron have mentioned how we've been hearing so many commitments from financial institutions, and in some ways there's so many that it's hard to keep track of and even wonder, you know, what does this all add up to? But in my experience from the sort of circles that I'm in and the tables that I'm at, the seriousness of financial institutions around trying to wrestle with how to tackle climate change is really significant. And one example of that is the Cooperators has joined the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance earlier this year. So the UN convened group of asset owners, where there are only 2 Canadian institutions as part of that one. And at that table are, you know, our $11 billion in assets are among the smallest of the institutional investors who are there. All of the people as part of that Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance these are senior decision makers in these large financial institutions. They are driven by the science first and foremost of climate change, and they're also driven by a desire to be extremely transparent in the progress that they're making towards net zero. So I guess that was a long way of saying my short answer, which is very serious.
Thanks for starting us off, Chad. I'm going to now introduce Sandra. Sandra is VP of Social Impact and Sustainability at Scotiabank, where she leads the team responsible for corporate sustainability, global donations, employee engagement, and ESG reporting. She also serves on the bank's Global Inclusion Council and co-chairs the Control Functions Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Sandra joined the bank in November of 2019 with almost 25 years of experience in environmental science, corporate sustainability, and responsible finance. Her extracurriculars are equally as impressive, if I may say, and include serving as a board director for the Transition Accelerator and Next Canada, just to name a few. So Sandra, very much a pleasure to have you join us today for today's conversation. And basically same question to you, your pulse check, 1 minute answer. When push comes to shove, like we're seeing these investments being made by climate concerned investors, will this really shape investment decisions around hydrocarbon development?
So yeah, I think the short answer is yes, I think investors are serious in believing it's the right thing to do. And I also think that they're serious in believing that they're going to achieve those goals. But in addition, I also think there's an enormous range, and we'll probably talk about it through this panel, an enormous range in how investors, number one, intend to reach the goals, number two, whether they're even sure of how they're going to reach the goals, and number three, of how they're measuring success. And I think that I would sort of wrap that up by saying one of the things that I think, one of the expectations in the investment community, that it's going to be able to go net zero. I worry about how much people have really thought about the fact that absolutely everything has a carbon footprint and everything emits, not just hydrocarbon industries. So I think the how we're going to get there is where it's going to get really interesting.
100% agree. I see a lot of our panelists already nodding. So I'm going to turn to Nicholas Parker now. Nicholas is what he calls an exponential impact entrepreneur, and rightly so, I would say. Nick pioneers sustainability-oriented impact ventures, funds, and initiatives around the world. Over the past 3 decades, he started Canada's leading environmental strategy firm, created the world's largest innovation platform of its kind, and launched an $800 million investment group, and founded a state-owned water company. And above all of those things, in addition, he's also worked in over 50 countries around the world. So he's currently chairman of Parker Venture Management, where he makes catalytic investments, presently in solar, CCUS, fintech, energy storage, and AI. And if you didn't know, he in fact was the individual who coined and developed the concept of clean tech in 2002 when launching the Clean Tech Group. Nick, pleasure to have you with us today. As someone whose career has really focused on attracting investment, same question to you. What's your one minute pulse check? We're seeing these investors make these commitments. Will these commitments really shape investment in hydrocarbon development?
So I might go over my 1 minute pulse check, but I'm happy to be shaved cut back at the back end, because I think, like Chad, we need to really set the table properly here. But first of all, my own land acknowledgement, I'm on unceded territory in what today we call Toronto. But let's just set the table here properly. Fully executed, the Paris Agreement gets us 40% of the way there. We're on track to a 2.7, 2.9 degree temperature change, which by the end of this decade means a 1.6 temperature increase. And the effects are as bad, if not worse, than have been projected. And if we don't like what we're seeing, this is 1990 CO2 in the atmosphere, and there's more to come. So it's no surprising that public and private markets are responding. In the public markets, we're seeing ESG investing hitting about $50 trillion by 2025, about a third of global assets under management. And in Europe, they're leading on this, and you're seeing this play out in debt and other markets. The energy transition, we're told, will require, between 50 and $20 trillion a year by 2030. Right now we're spending about 500 billion. Larry Fink talks about the great transition, and there'll be 1,000 climate or clean tech unicorns. And yet BlackRock still has $87 billion invested in the fossil fuel sector. So it's, to put it as a Canadian, where's the puck going? We could actually say, where the puck are we going? Just to stir things up. In the private markets, so I would advocate in the public markets, the direction is very clear, and we'll come back further in the conversation about what the implications are. In the private capital markets, we've just broken through $40 billion of innovation financing globally in climate or clean tech. $40 billion. last year, and we're already on track to break that number this year. In fact, in terms of capital formation and funds, there's way more capital formed into funds this year than in the past 5 years put together. So if you go back 5, 10, 15, 20 years, the numbers are just extraordinary. So I think it's pretty clear that two things are happening. Investors want change, and innovators are delivering on that change.
Fabulous. You very much described kind of your world, a world of exponentials that we're experiencing right now. So thank you for that. Trevor, welcome. It's extremely happy to see you today. Trevor McCloud is someone who really lives and breathes this question as Director of ESG and Public Policy with Enbridge. In this role, Trevor led the development of Enbridge's net zero emissions reduction target and is responsible for building the architecture to ensure those targets are achieved. Trevor's experience spans the law, policy, and think tanks alike. He's worked with Alberta Energy in the private law in forestry and energy sectors, as well as spent time with not-for-profits in academia. His experience brings together a clear passion for natural resources, Indigenous perspectives, the environment, finance, and the systems that connect all of those things. So Trevor, tremendously excited to have this opportunity to hear from you and have you weigh in with your pulse check on that question. We're seeing investors make these commitments. Will they really shape investments for hydrocarbon development, in your opinion?
Thanks, Karen. You know, I think my short answer is it's already impacting investment decisions, but it's also impacting the investment decisions that companies are making, right? And so I think probably useful for me to provide a bit of a reflection on from that corporate perspective. You know, I joined Enbridge 4 years ago, and you know, there was some sort of ESG pressure, mostly felt in the sustainability group. Wasn't really hitting investor relations in the same way. In fact, I'd say that the vast majority of investors, the strongest message coming through was that energy companies should kind of stick to their knitting, you know, do what they do best. And this isn't that long ago, right? Enbridge has long been a proponent of building optionality into the business, and you know, clearly important during significant disruption and uncertainty. But 4 years ago, very much an underlying belief that you know, investors would frown on oil and gas companies that were diversifying too quickly into renewables, renewable natural gas, hydrogen, CCUS, and the like. So we were still making these investments. You know, 2002, first wind farm we built in Saskatchewan. Since then, put about $8 billion into renewables, focused now on offshore wind in Europe, and we're putting money into renewable natural gas, hydrogen, et cetera. We built the first utility scale, you know, power to gas green hydrogen facility in Markham, Ontario, and put it into service in 2018. So some of those investments are still being made, but we weren't putting them in the window, right? We were reticent to put them in the window. Fast forward to last month, we had a full ESG forum. You know, it was all just ESG. We're putting it in the window. Everything's speeding up. Investors are serious. They have integrated, from my perspective, they seem to have integrated ESG thinking into their investor screens. They want to see targets. They want to see serious targets. They want to see that companies are serious about meeting them. They want to see our capital allocation plans. They want to see everything, and they want to see it now. And the conversation's moving really quickly. You know, I think next week we'll hear about something that I haven't heard of yet. So this, I think, in turn is reshaping corporate strategy, and it's reshaping capital allocation process. Maybe I'll just leave it there.
That's awesome. You know, I've often said to everyone I've been talking to lately, I kind of feel like I get whiplash every time I open the news lately. It's just something new always hitting you in the face. And these are the times we live in. So I appreciate the warm up with the introductions. And so let's start with a big question, you know, while we have everyone out of the gate. You know, to my mind, it's really about what's in and out when we talk about a net zero future. And, you know, even looking back on this year, it's been a year of commitments. Investors, companies, governments, all drawing a line in the sand around net zero or carbon neutrality. I think at last count, I saw the number of 137 countries around the world have made some type of commitment or aspiration in that space. So, you know, as you turn, however, to how people think about getting to a net zero future, those that you see different camps emerge. Those that see no role for hydrocarbons in a net zero economy, and those that do, and everywhere in between that. It's a thorny issue For example, the initial exclusion of oil and gas from the EU sustainable finance taxonomy, which many saw as that golden standard, really was the trigger for the private sector effort in Canada to develop the transition finance taxonomy that is industry inclusive. So I'm just curious to hear from all of you, and we'll work backwards. We'll start from Trevor and we'll end with Chad. How do you see hydrocarbons and a net zero economy? Is this an oxymoron for you, an invitation for creativity, a destination, or just part of the journey? Trevor, very quickly, 2 minutes, your answer on that. Maybe a high ask.
I'll try to do it quickly.
Yeah.
It's like such an important question, right? And one that everyone's grappling with. So I think I'm just going to give it to you straight. You know, my view is if we're going to achieve 1.5 degrees, then, you know, we need innovation across the entire energy system, and we need all hands on deck, right? I personally, despite having read all the scenarios, I can't see a situation in which we achieve 1.5 degrees without hydrocarbons playing a key role. And so, you know, and then one of the biggest challenges I think that we face today is finding a way to connect two very disparate conversations that are happening. One that sort of starts from a energy fundamentals, supply and demand fundamentals point of view, right? Which is forecasting into the future and sort of looking at, you know, what does the system look like today? What do we need in the future? And I think this discussion relies too much on sort of looking at the current energy system and probably lacks a bit in vision for the art of the possible, right? And then you have that other discussion that's really looking backcasting from a desired future state, you know, and that, you know, so where do we need to be? What needs to happen in order to get there? And this discussion tends to be grounded in carbon budgets and climate scenarios, and you know, it probably discounts current reality and makes what I would call maybe even an irresponsible assumption about the role of hydrocarbons. And so in this highly uncertain world, you know, where the stakes are very high, you know, it doesn't, in my mind, make a lot of sense to put all your eggs in one basket. Renewable energy costs have absolutely come down remarkably, and renewables have grown exponentially over that time. Any conference you go to, you see the chart, right? Just like it's impressive, and but it's not. There needs to be more. But it's equally remarkable, and it gets underplayed, that despite that exponential growth, fossil fuels continue to comprise 80+% of global energy consumption, and that's currently still growing. So, you know, today, global electricity demand alone is growing faster than renewables, right? So they aren't even covering, renewables aren't even covering that growth, let alone replacing the existing energy system. So yes, we need a heck of a lot more investment in renewables. And, you know, by the way, there's a ton of capital chasing those projects. I think of our offshore wind, you know, trying to buy subsea in Europe, and, you know, margins are getting squeezed. And so it's a really difficult space. You know, so look at all of this, and I sort of say it's very hard to see situation in which hydrocarbons aren't a big part of that energy mix going forward. And if that's the case, then, you know, if hydrocarbons are going to be around, then it makes a heck of a lot of sense to me to put some effort, serious effort, into cleaning them up. So it might not be the sexiest thing to talk about these days, but I think it's one of the most important.
Very good. Awesome, Trevor. Nicholas, curious about your thoughts on that, the role of hydrocarbons in a net zero economy.
Yeah, I don't think it's a black and white thing, and it's not a invest, divest type situation. And hydrocarbons are not all created equal either. You know, there's low cost jurisdictions and jurisdictions where we feel more comfortable with the ethics of the jurisdiction and so on and so forth. But I think that in a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, you know, long-term investors are looking for stability. They're not hedge funds. And so they're looking for long-term trajectory. And how do you determine that when you're backing a hydrocarbon company? Well, you've got to look at its CapEx, you've got to look at its R&D. And I think that's really what it's about, is, are you making the transition? Are you becoming a DOM? Are you, as happened in the Nordic region? Secondly, I want to see how you're going to use your assets. And I think this is what interests investors as well. So for example, take famous Kinder Morgan. You know, they are now positioning themselves to be the pipeline company for CO2. and their expertise is absolutely vital. Thirdly, while investors are hammering companies like Enbridge on net zero, around the corner is nature. Around the corner is other things, and nature, as we'll see this year, is the new narrative around climate in many ways. And so it's going to get more complex. Add that to the reporting schedule of a large corporation. But last but not least, I think what I want to see from what I think is the role of hydrocarbon companies here is investors want to see a systems-based approach to things. They want to see a marriage between innovation, infrastructure, inclusion, and they want to see how you're going to manage for that. So the level of sophistication is extraordinarily demanding on people who are in the C-suite of these companies. And then just finally, what I would add is what I think investors are looking for is how are you using not so much clean innovation, but the sort of exponential technologies. For example, can we use the blockchain now to really do the right thing on carbon credits and get money, for example, to farmers? And how do you monetize that? The role of AI. BCG and Ellen MacArthur and others have shown, and as has EFL in some of the work you've been doing, the role of AI. And so again, with all of the above here, I think there is a role, a diminishing role. I think it's a particularly challenging situation for Alberta, of course, because it's high carbon, high cost. And that's why I said it's a nuanced answer. But clearly, over our lifetimes, of those of us who are on this call, there will be oil and gas. But I think change takes a long time. And then when it comes, it happens very quickly. And I think that's the challenge we're facing.
Very good. Thank you for that. I'm hearing from both of you so far, less a question of if and very much almost a question of differentiation and what will be that differentiator. So thank you for that. Sandra, over to you. Your thoughts on hydrocarbons in a net zero economy. How do you square or not square those?
Great. Well, I agree largely with what was already said, particularly with respect to the one thing that resonated was the comment about the disconnect between forecasting and backcasting. That's something that we struggle with a lot. And in fact, one of the notes I jotted down when I was thinking about this as you were talking was, it's really important that when we're thinking about this and when we're listening to our stakeholders, that we're remembering and reminding people that a scenario is not the same as a forecast. And, scenarios in many cases are backcasting from, well, if we were to do this really, really difficult, complicated thing by 2050, what would have to happen? But it doesn't mean that all those things are actually reliably predicted to happen or to be able to happen, at least not all of them at once. And so that said, I do think that, having looked at a number of scenarios in recent year, there are many credible scenarios for the future that do include hydrocarbons, and many scenarios from people who spend a lot of time thinking about this and a lot of time looking at global issues in addition to climate change, but the need for access to energy for people who are not as lucky as we are in the world and don't have two cars in their driveway and, the ability to have electricity 24 hours a day as we do. So when you look across the needs globally, I actually think whether it's the best thing for the climate or not, I think that credible scenarios that look at social justice issues as well as environment do include a future for hydrocarbons. And actually also believe that it is an invitation to creativity. It's definitely not going to look the way it looks now. And for example, I'm thinking about the plan that was put forward recently by the largest oil sands companies for a net zero by 2050 plan. And actually they're looking at 35% reduction by 2030. I mean, that's going to require innovation, but it also speaks to large scale deployment of existing technologies and some new technologies, to Nick's point. And when innovation happens, it's never linear, right? It's like you feel like it's going nowhere, and then boom, there's a step change. I think that, you know, if we could get to low emission or even zero emission oil and gas, that would take things a long way. But when you think about the systems change that's needed, we're going to have to talk about the demand for hydrocarbons for all those reasons that I was just saying. Like, people can't freeze in the dark. And so if we want a world where people are not freezing in the dark, there's probably a role for hydrocarbons in the foreseeable future. We just have to figure out how to do it with a way, way smaller footprint.
Very interesting, really putting people at the center of the transition conversation. I really appreciate you doing that.
They
Chad.
have to be on board.
Yes, agreed. Chad, your thoughts? Hydrocarbons net zero.
I liked in your question, Karen, when you said an invitation to creativity. I think I'll just build a little bit from Sandra's point there, because I think, I mean, if we start from the idea of a carbon budget that Trevor mentioned earlier, and that there's, you know, there's only so much carbon, or maybe more specifically, so many emissions that we can have in the transition from now to 2050 in order to stick within 1.5 degrees, then I think that's the important place to start. And if we were only basing it on today's technology or today's industries and so on, then it would be frankly, a pretty you know, bleak outlook, I think, for the industry. But of course we're not, and that's what we're referring to here. And for that, I think the invitation to creativity is really around, this is not just about the material of a hydrocarbon, but the problem is the emissions. The actual material could be a quite useful thing for the transition to a low emissions future. So that's where I feel most excited and energized about the possible role of hydrocarbons in a net zero future, is in how might we use this material or these, you know, substances differently in order to accelerate. So the bitumen beyond combustion idea that Alberta Innovates is pioneering is a great example of that. I think, you know, finding alternative uses for bitumen where its carbon intensity are actually an asset rather than a liability, and like carbon fiber, which can then replace other materials in things like cars, in order to actually make the car lighter, in order to actually make them more fuel efficient and so on. So that's where the usefulness of the material becomes the issue. We're tackling emissions, and we're seeing all of these potential pathways as options in the journey to that net zero future. So yeah, I think that's really where the invitation to creativity likely needs to lead most.
So great to hear some of our investor voices on the panel today really calling for creativity. So if you'll let me for a moment, Sandra and Chad, I just want to delve into your worlds a little bit more. Framing for anyone who's read the news, the calls from the financial sector to address climate just continue to grow. So just want to get your perspective on where Canada's investor organizations are at right now. Sandra, if I can start with you. Right before COP, we had the announcement that 6 Canada's largest banks, BMO, CIBC, National Bank of Canada, RBC, TD, and your home base, Scotia, will join the Net Zero Banking Alliance to accelerate efforts to address climate. Yet many of our banks continue, and I think we've already said this, to be heavily invested in fossil fuel projects. What then do you see is the role of banks in enabling action towards a net zero future, or how do hydrocarbons fit into that picture for you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so thanks for that question. So yes, we adopted we committed to the Net Zero Banking Alliance, I guess almost 2 weeks ago now. I will say that it was really formalizing work that I know in our shop we've been working on for a while, and I think our peer banks as well. You know, in terms of the role of banks, I think it's really important to recognize that for a bank, we touch every single part of the economy. And everything, as your grade 5 teacher might have said, everything pollutes. Or maybe mine was just a really pessimistic grade 5 teacher, but everything pollutes. I find it's really interesting. There's obviously a deep focus on, and there's a lot of, you always see, well, so-and-so committed to this, and yet they still finance the oil and gas sector. Well, because, banks and investors finance, especially banks finance the economy, the amount of financing that we do that has an emission footprint is all of it. And that includes, as we're looking through our portfolios, residential mortgages are a huge piece of the carbon footprint of a bank. Huge, much, I won't say necessarily bigger than oil and gas for everyone, but probably for some banks, they are. In the case of our bank, our portfolio exposure to oil and gas is under 2% of our portfolio. And so the relative footprint of that compared to something like real estate is actually, it's comparable or possibly smaller. So I think that that's really good context setting for questions about where are banks placing their financing. And it also speaks to an important question about what drives emissions. Is it the supply or the demand and use of the product? So for a bank, the bottom line for us is that our ability to meet a net zero and enable a net zero future are really dependent on things we don't directly control. And those are things like what's going on in the sectors and the countries where we do business. So yes, we have, we have our own footprint. We have a lot of buildings and branches of our own, and we have to take care of that. We have our own supply chain, but by far the biggest piece of our footprint is our scope 3 or our clients' emissions, basically. And our clients' emissions, in turn, and the degree to which those are ramping down depend on a bunch of things. Government policy, we think, and I don't know if anyone would disagree, government policy is the biggest driver of a country's ability to decarbonize in an orderly fashion, as well as technological innovation, industry action. Consumer demand is massive. Anyway, I could go into it more, but I think you know what I'm talking about. So at the end of the day, what we think is that because every sector, every company, every individual client that we have contributes to greenhouse gas emissions, it's not feasible for us to stop financing things that cause greenhouse gas emissions, especially things that are critical products and services to society.
Again, like really walking that tension between where we need to go and how we get there. I have so many questions for you right now, but I do want to give Chad some time to weigh in on his views. Chad, you bring a very different perspective to that investor question, from the insurer side of the equation. So just curious to hear from you. Are you seeing things similarly? Is there some difference or similarity between the insurance world and net zero financing and investment?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. There is definitely some similarity, although I would say in the insurance side of it, it's a little bit further behind. By that I mean there's been a lot more progress and people have been working on a lot longer, I think, on investors and financed emissions and so on. And there's a reason for that, which I'll share in a moment. But on the insurance side, there has also been a launch of a net zero insurance alliance just in the last couple of months. It's a fairly small group so far, although growing, of mostly European large insurers and reinsurers. The methodologies are not yet developed. How does one calculate insured emissions, whereas they are on financed emissions, or at least they're a lot further along on what's the methodology to calculate the carbon intensity of an investment portfolio. Similar work is now underway on the insurance side. One of the first acts of that new Net Zero Insurance Alliance was to partner with PCAF, the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, to who have really led the way in developing how to calculate financed emissions, and they're working together now to develop a similar methodology for how to calculate insured emissions, noting that there will be similar issues to what Sandra just reflected, that the mind quickly goes to commercial insurance, you know, like oil and gas, or high emitting sectors or whatever. But similarly, you know, the insured emissions from homes, from autos, and so on is equally, maybe even more significant. So anyway, that methodological work is going to happen over the next year or two. The parallels, I think, are you know, in investment, there was a drive to divestment, and then there was a kind of evolution into, there's still a divestment, but there's an evolution into also looking at what can we do with our money instead of what are we not going to do with our money. And similarly with insurance, the starting point has been there are some sectors that are sort of becoming more where an exclusion, like coal, for example, where there's more of an exclusion on an insurance side. But I think more quickly learning the lessons from the investment experience, the focus will be on what can insurers do to actually engage and try to instill, how can they use their influence to instill or to catalyze action, I guess, among those that they insure. It's harder because it's obviously in a way easier to influence the priorities of a company if you're an owner of that company than an investor than it is if you're an insurer of that company. So that it's not as clear how strong the lever will be, or how an insurer can do that. But I think that's the trajectory that it's headed on in that world too.
Very good. Both you and Sandra are just like highlighting the fact for me that, you know, you're seeing increasingly these blueprints almost come up from investor groups around what activity needs to meet in order to continue to be attractive. Nick and Trevor, I just want to turn to the two of you now, given that both of you work directly with companies positioning or perhaps repositioning themselves in an evolving energy landscape, and, you know, as individuals who obviously interact with investors on a regular basis. My question to you is as follows. Is there anything in particular that you'd like to see investors focus on that perhaps currently isn't front and center right now of the conversation? Someone said, I believe it was you, Nick, that nature is that next conversation. And if anything in particular that you want to focus on as it relates to oil and gas companies. So Trevor, let's start with you as someone who's bridging these conversations between incumbent industry investors already. What are your thoughts? Where should investors be focusing on more?
Thanks. I think the conversations are getting better all the time, right? And really applaud these efforts to sort of bring different investors together, like Climate Action 100 Plus and the relatively new Climate Engagement Canada effort. It's very helpful to have those conversations together as opposed to, you know, filling up the calendar each day individually. So we'll really applaud those efforts. And I think that the discussions are strong and good. If I was going to put one thing on the table, you know, I think our discussions at Enbridge in particular focus on, you know, on climate and emissions more specifically, and then also Indigenous rights. Those are the two top items that we talk about. And while these discussions, I think, can get quite granular in their own right, they're sort of separate in some ways. And I'd love to see more integrated thinking about how the conversations fit together. And so maybe just to pull that thread a little bit more, we get a lot of questions about science-based targets, about net zero, about just transition, about biodiversity, as Nick was talking about, and about Indigenous rights. But, you know, and here's a good example. So we have our net zero targets, and we have 4 pathways, one of which is offsets. And they're an excellent tool for enhancing biodiversity and for Indigenous economic inclusion, but they're prohibited by the Science-Based Target Initiative, right? And so I think, as Nick was talking about, like this, as we start talking more about biodiversity, I think we need to integrate these conversations so we're aiming at more than just one goal at a time. And I think that would be particularly helpful. Maybe I'll leave it there.
Wonderful. I see Nick already nodding to your response. So curious, Nick, anything to add or challenge on that?
Well, I think I sort of downloaded to everybody on the call some of my things that I think investors are not paying attention to. But maybe I'll just zoom out rather than zoom in before we get to the final question you've got about transition strategies. And it's, most of us on this call really get climate change and want to see action speeded up. But we've got to be careful what we wish for. If we have a carbon bubble and it bursts, i.e. we recognize that the companies are overvalued given the remaining carbon budget we have, that will affect our pension funds and our retirement savings and the ability of those investors to recycle capital, use capital to fund the transition. So it's really important, I think, that we understand where the dots are joined, and that that we're very careful what we also ask of government, including investors. Right now, most of the asks of government are fiscal. Put money here, invest there. And yet we know we have a difficult fiscal situation in Canada, as most other countries that have been fortunate enough to be able to fund our way through the pandemic. And so I want to see much more monetary signals. I want to see a reshaping of markets so companies are rewarded. Because right now, companies are under tremendous pressure to act. And yet there's not a price signal that rewards them. So for example, we care now about resilience coming out of the pandemic and so on. And there's a price increasingly on resilience. Do we just want an efficient grid or do we want a reliable grid, for example? We're still not being clear about what price we should put on these things, what price should be on nature. So I feel there's much more work to be done on the monetary side in terms of pricing things and less on fiscal stimulus so that we can get on with shaping markets and we align where capital wants to go, which is it wants to invest in the long term. And right now, that long term is not very predictable.
Very good. So many roles that policy can take in this space right now. I love that you're expanding our view of that. Chad, I saw your hand up. Was that a hallucination?
Yeah, I was just going to add one. I know I wanted to throw one in the mix here, just a specific topic that I feel investors, it maybe builds a bit from what Nick was just saying. Investors need to be figuring out what role they want to play, which is around resilience. Specifically, I'm thinking of climate adaptation. In the drive to net zero, we can't forget that there's going to be major impacts that we're going to have to weather and navigate, and we're frankly pretty unprepared for those from a infrastructure standpoint and beyond. So I think there is and could be a greater role for private investors as well, and not just governments, for sorting out how to make sure that we're well prepared to adapt to the effects of climate change in it while we pursue the net zero future as well.
Karen, if I may just very quickly, 20 seconds riff on that. We talk about moving to a circular economy. And yet we're still using a Cartesian approach to investing in that economy. So we're still using a siloed, reductionist, linear approach and applying that. So we've talked about creativity, and I would throw back at Chad and Sandra and so on, that the creativity is not just entrepreneurs with smart ideas about how to repurpose and use technology for all kinds of things. It's the investment system that has to come up with a new way of thinking, let alone acting. And right now we're not getting those outcomes. And so I think I would throw this back, that we need creativity within the financing system, and we need much more creativity about how we use monetary instruments.
If I'm going to change up the schedule a little bit, simply because of that creativity comment, I'm going to move on to just expanding that a little bit. So Chad and Nick, let's continue this conversation a little bit. Lots of concerns about the cost to reduce emissions and, transition or pivot operations right now to address some of these expectations. So a question to the two of you about the potential of new financial tools such as transition finance. Transition finance is something that was identified as a priority for Canada by the expert panel for sustainable finance, very much as a way to offer, especially high emitters, financing to help shift to lower zero emissions models. Obviously, the need for this to reach global climate goals seems fairly undisputable, but it hasn't reached mainstream yet. It's still very hotly debated. So the question is, do you see this as a viable and pending investment category, and what can it mean for the energy sector? So if it's okay, I'll start with Chad, throw it to Nick, and then invite Sandra and Trevor to comment if that is a good process for this. So Chad, appreciate your thoughts. I know Cooperators and Addenda launched 2 funds of that nature this year. So transition finance, where do you sit on that?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. I mean, so first of all, for Canada, I think this is crucial for all the reasons that the expert panel identified and that we've been talking about here, frankly, is I think we're unlikely to meet our national goals in terms of Paris and emissions reductions unless we can find a way to reduce across the whole economy, including in the areas that are high emitting right now. So if transition finance can become a tool to aid in that, then I think I think it should, then I think it's critical. What we don't want transition finance to become is code or justification for the status quo and, for legitimizing how we do business today. So I think that's the really key question is how can we, and speaks to Nick's point about creativity, how can we create new financial categories, investment products, and so on, and deals that will really make it clear that that's where the investments are going, is to help in the emissions reductions of the industries that really need to transition the most significantly. So I'm optimistic that the Cooperators has sort of made some, like you said, some early moves in there through Addenda Capital, but also some commitments. So we've set a goal of getting to 60% of our invested assets being in either impact or transition investments by 2030, which is, I'm going to say, a pretty bold thing to do, given that it's still an emerging category. So we're committed to trying to make that happen because we think it's really important.
Awesome, thank you. Nick, I'm curious, given your experience in the whole ecosystem of investing, what are your views on transition finance, or do we need other approaches in addition to that?
Sounds good. No,
so simple.
yeah, sounds good.
Yeah.
You got to get down to the nitty gritty, right? And in fairness, I haven't read the report in full. I know of it. I look to those who've already started making the journey. What do we mean? Well, in Europe, companies like Engie and EDF and Dong, albeit have made the transition by either laying out a plan like Dong did, and you just look at their market value, and it speaks for itself. The transition from old energy to new. But the way I would do is split the assets, the old economy assets and the new economy assets, and let the legacy assets deal with themselves and wind down. But most importantly, recycling the cash flow. This is where I think hydrocarbons are so important, not only in meeting current needs until we transition, but it's the cash flow, because that's going to be essential. Again, we can't run to Mummy in Ottawa or in Edmonton because the money's not there. And if we do want to take that money, we better start closing hospitals and other things. So split the old from the new, make it clear, recycle cash flow, encourage direct investments by corporations in open innovation, whether it's corporate venturing or not, and emphasize the assets that large corporations can bring to the table, such as permitting, research capabilities, technical know-how, that young companies don't have, and really build what I call a networked enterprise and do these things. But sort of two quick final things. One is what I would call transition bonds. And that's learning from the whole social bond movement, where the outcomes may be a social benefit, and the pricing and rewards on those bonds are tied to those benefits. So it makes it really binary and very simple. And a lot of this is going to be debt finance rather than equity. And then finally, I think, look at your real assets. If you're good at drilling, you got geothermal. If you if you know how to do offshore stuff, great. We need that too for wind. But I think the big play in Canada, the one that we're way behind and yet we think we're really good at, is CCUS. Whether it's new ways to monetize bitumen, or but just dealing with carbon. And this is a $1 trillion market. And we have the ability to be leaders in this, but we're risk averse. We talked in Kananaskis a decade ago about the green transition, and everybody who talked about it was laughed out of the room. We talked about it in Ontario 15 years ago, green mobility strategy. We didn't act on it. And now we're picking up the pieces. So we've got to be much bolder, much clearer. And I think that transition finance makes sense if we apply some of the things that I've just mentioned.
Fabulous. Sandra and Trevor, I'll ask you to weigh in. You started the conversation on transition finance and exploring kind of the creativity that we may need to see from the investment community. Sandra, do you have any thoughts on that as a investor on the investor side, and Trevor on the issuer side?
One thing I'll say about transition finance is I think it's absolutely critical. It's a critically important part of financing. And I haven't been at the table for all the discussions underway in Canada, and certainly there's been a lot of effort put into defining a transition finance taxonomy for Canada. It's been underway for a little while now, and based on the amount of consultation and debate that's happened around those tables, from what I understand, I guess it's clear that it's not a simple thing to do. There's not uniform agreement on what is eligible to be called transition finance. I really like Nick's idea that the proof is in your financing with there's a theory of change behind the financing, and you'll be able to point to success in very clear KPIs that show the money did help to transition the sector, the project, the industry, whatever it is your financing instrument is funding. But just simply based on the amount of discussion and the number of players that have been noodling on this for a while, I think it's not an easy thing to define. So I that's my contribution, which is probably not that helpful, but it looks like it's really hard.
I don't think anyone would disagree with you on that one. Trevor, any thoughts?
I mean, we're a big fan of transition finance for all the reasons sort of let's set out previously in the panel, right? But I think we accessed $3 billion in sustainability-linked finance in 2021, and continue to see that as an important piece of our financing strategy going forward. With respect to what hydrocarbons can kind of do to in its future, I just want to pick up on a couple of things here that have been mentioned, and one is differentiated oil and gas, right? So clearly there's a need that, as I think Chad said, status quo is not going to cut it. That's true, and so this notion of differentiated or responsible oil and gas is important, and I think that's what the ESG targets that have been coming out and net zero targets, et cetera, have started to move toward. And I think we're seeing more rigor put around it with certification efforts. Project Canary and Equitable Origin, et cetera. And so I think that's really important. And I think adding in that Indigenous component, I think really a competitive advantage for North American energy sector, if we can get that right. And we're getting way better at it, right? Not there yet, but still doing quite a bit better. So I think adding all those sort of responsible kind of elements into it, I think are critical. And then capital should continue to chase that differentiated product. And then the other one is using existing infrastructure to catalyze that energy system of the future, right? So Chad talked about the carbon budget, and there's so much debate going on about the future of natural gas, and for so many, natural gas is kind of, you put into the carbon budget as a fixed, right? But it should be a variable, right? As you talk about blending hydrogen into the system, as you talk about blending RNG into the system, and catalyzing that hydrogen economy, right? By increasing the amount of hydrogen that's produced and has a positive use. And so, we move 20% of the natural gas consumed in the United States. If we could blend 5% hydrogen into that, that would be a pretty significant amount of hydrogen. And we're starting down that path. And Markham, we've got we're blending into the 2% into the system. I know in other places it's more. We're looking at it and doing it in Quebec as well. So I think, there's opportunity to use the existing infrastructure to catalyze the energy systems of the future, as EFL says, the systems of the future requires of us. And so I just want to put those two things on the table.
Very much, very appreciated. Interesting how fast the time goes when you get a group of such smart people together. And so before I open it up for audience questions, one final question to everyone on the panel today, almost seeking your advice. The work around future-fit hydrocarbons that we're leading right now really sees Alberta as a center of gravity for a lot of this because of the hydrocarbon sector that we have here. So what should a resource-rich jurisdiction like Alberta be looking to achieve by 2030 from your perspective? And what will be our greatest barrier opportunity in terms of financing that? So whatever piece of that question you feel you want to weigh in on, that's great. And I'll just give you 10 seconds to noodle on that. And I'll start with Nick, go to Chad, Sandra, and then Trevor, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So 2030.
Okay. Last chance city here. Alberta is resource rich. Let's start with the number one resource anywhere in the world today going forward, which is people, intelligence, human capacity. And I think Alberta has to reframe how it sees itself, because every time I come to Alberta, I go to the AI Institute, or I go into the healthcare innovation sector. There's tremendous innovation. So I think Alberta has got to see itself as not necessarily as a natural resources-based province, but as a resource base in terms of people. And I think within that, it's about the demand side for these solutions, whether it's in hydrogen, CCUS, or whatever, and create the demand side, create the enabling environment, and you will attract not only in local innovation, but you'll attract the best innovators from around the world. And there's no reason why, if Houston made the transition to a services-based economy, why Alberta in the oil and gas area over time can't make the transition to the leading place where low carbon solutions are there. And I think you're on your way. And by the end of the decade, as I've joked in the past, you'll have renamed your hockey teams to the Calgary Solars and the Edmonton Wind. And then we know the transition is well underway.
Oh man, I have to buy a new jersey. Okay, thank you for that, Nicholas. Chad, what are your thoughts on that? 2030, what should...
I was with Nick until that last part there.
Comment, yeah.
Yeah. No, I think the point about talent is a great one, Nick. And I think in terms of barrier, part of it is just the story we tell ourselves about ourselves. What kind of a people are we? And in relation to this issue specifically, I think, I think we should, to answer my own question there, I think we should, the starting point for this should be a narrative about we're a people of possibility. And that's really where the sort of distinct, from my perspectives, qualities and characteristics of the Alberta culture kind of really shine through. And so I do think that in relation to this issue, that is really about showing up with intention to be part of the solution, rather than sort of viewing this transition that's happening as a problem. And I think, you know, there have been some great, lots of great examples emerge from Alberta. There have been lots of great narratives recently about how that can happen. And I really just think it's a mindset thing. It's, you know, this transition that's happening can be an opportunity for us if we have the right mindset about it.
Very, very good. The stories that we tell ourselves are very, very important. Sandra, thoughts on resource-rich jurisdiction like Alberta 2030?
Well, I will preface my comments by saying it makes me very nervous as someone who lives in Ontario to be opining on what Alberta should do. I feel like that's gotten lots of people in trouble in the past. But I will also say that having worked for and led an Alberta-based small company for a couple of years, I do think that what Chad and Nick said is exactly where I'm going to go with this. I think that Albertans themselves sometimes, but certainly the rest of Canada, doesn't always recognize the incredibly well-educated, talented, and innovative workforce and citizens that live in Alberta, and the potential, and that is already unfolding, to leverage that resource, whether it's to think about ways to continue to transition the energy sector, but also to look at all of the other things that that amount of highly concentrated talent could do for Canada and for the world, is where I would say it would be great to see more of that. It would be great to see Alberta and Albertans leveraging that resource, and that's the human resource, to solve a whole range of problems, and the energy system problem being certainly a big one. But there's just so many other things. I think that, you know, on the energy front, I think the challenge, and again, it's nothing that the people in Alberta haven't already thought about, but really the question is, how does Alberta's richness, and not just in bitumen, but in everything, how does that help fit into a very changing energy supply and demand system? So how do you leverage all that stuff to make the most out of the future that is unfolding? You know, whether we aren't driving it, it's happening globally, or at least efforts to transform the system are happening globally. So I just think maybe Nick said it the best, is for Alberta to think of itself as resource rich in human resources. Those aren't the exact words Nick said, but that's what I take from it. And it would be wonderful to see that.
Really reframing a lot of how we see resources in general. Trevor, your final thoughts before we open to discussion from the audience.
Yeah, you know, I'm staring out the window as I'm listening, trying to come up with a different answer, because honestly, it's largely my answer too. And I want a different answer, but I think it's valuable to say it because it is the challenge, right? Alberta needs to figure out how to get people to pay attention again. People have largely made up their minds about Alberta and about, you know, the oil sands, for example. And I think, you know, absent some kind of a new framing, a new approach, a new energy, you know, nobody's going to pay attention to Alberta. You know, I came here from Saskatchewan years ago when Alberta was very exciting. It was to come to, and you know, I think it still is, but I don't think that the stories are getting out there, and I don't think people are listening. And so I'm not sure how to fix that, but I think that's what needs to be fixed. So same answer.
a different take on it, though. I really appreciate that. So some hard-hitting questions from our audience. So I'll read them out, and whoever wants to weigh in, feel free. But we have, going back a little bit to the nitty-gritty around future-fit hydrocarbons and just the hydrocarbon challenge in general. One question from the audience right now: how do we address the fact that the majority of our hydrocarbon value chain emissions are exported in Canada? Going to your comment, Sandra, on scope 3, et cetera. So maybe you have some perspective on that, but.
I think it's a huge challenge. And in fact, it's funny, I wish I had the answer to that, is all I'm going to say. I think it's a really important consideration, and it speaks to that. It speaks to what we talked about a little bit in the panel around, this is a system problem. This isn't, it's not an oil and gas problem or a power sector problem or a financial sector problem. This is an issue around the entire global energy system. And because particularly around hydrocarbons are a global commodity, we are going to have to, this is where politics comes in, and we're going to have to be paying attention to what are some of the intended and unintended consequences of the things that we do within Canada on global emissions. So, we were talking about this in our own net zero discussions. You want to make sure that you don't try to solve the problem. You don't make the problem too small. That thing about, if you make a problem too small, you could create more trouble. You almost have to make it bigger to really attack it. And when you're talking about a globally traded commodity, like particularly oil and gas, I think that's the case. I don't know the answer. I think the governments are talking about, carbon border adjustments, for example, so that there's that countries and sectors that are doing the right thing in their own jurisdiction are not, undermined by other jurisdictions that may not have as stringent rules about, exporting things into our country. Similarly, we have to watch out for our products and services facing carbon-related tariffs. It starts to get very complicated because it's a global system. So I'd be really interested to hear if anyone else on the call has an answer to this, because we too are trying to wrap our heads around it. It's very complicated from what I can tell.
I'm happy to jump in on that. I think it's the case of really, through a climate lens, setting our sights higher, right? We've really sort of honed in on national emissions, and that's important, but it's not enough, and maybe not even the most important, right? So, focusing on reducing global emissions and thinking about our export-based economy, what that looks like, and the embedded carbon in all of our products, every product, not just what's in the oil sands, but in everything. And thinking about developing a bit of a industrial strategy around that. And I think, Sandra's right, like when you talk about border carbon adjustments, and, I think at some point, the United States is going to kind of figure out that they've got a carbon competitive advantage vis-a-vis China and some other, and what they probably figured it out already, but and act on it, right, and put in place border carbon adjustments. And to the extent that our products have higher embedded carbon than products coming from anywhere else or somewhere else, we're at a disadvantage. And so, how do we get ahead of that, and how do we set our sights higher on reducing global emissions and using the products that we make now, which, given our electricity system and the cleanliness of that electricity system, we have to have quite a few advantages already built in. And so how do we build a strategy around that? I think it's a really important question.
Very good. Nick or Chad, I'm just checking any thoughts on that before we move on to another question. Okay, we have another question from the audience around ESGs. So we talk about investors demanding ESG initiatives. What is the conversation when that is in conflict with maximizing return on investment? Is it an either or?
I think what's encouraging, I was going to make a point about Glasgow, because I'm a real cynic about this process. And I go back to the days of Morris Strong, and I've been involved since 1992 in this process. And I think it's heroic failure. But I think what it's done is by giving so much attention to Glasgow and all the things related to it, it has made a lot of people in the C-suite and in the around the investment committee table take a much harder look of where risks and opportunities lie. So the risks, of supply chain disruption and so on and so forth, carbon bubbles, have become so much more acute. And the opportunity side, oh my gosh, the cost curves, the innovation, the new business models, etc. And so I feel that in the ESG world, which was, really grew out of the socially responsible investing world, that was the teenage cousin of it, it is now less about checking the boxes and avoiding tobacco and all the things, and now much more about value destruction and creation. And if you look at the S&P 500, the top 500 companies, when I was born back in the 20th century, a company could expect to stay on the S&P 500 for 40 years before somebody else would come along and knock them off their perch. And today, a company will stay on the S&P for 10 years. And that means likely that the amount of time that a company stays on the S&P 500 will continue to reduce. So if that's the case, who are the winners of tomorrow? Who are the winners in 5 years, 10 years? And I think that's much more where ESG is going. It's much more aligned with risk and return than against it, and so I think that's one of the encouraging things that I'm seeing is environmental risk is now tied to financial risk and the upside equivalent as well.
Thank you for that. Very interesting to see those things come together more and more over time and more central to corporations. Trevor, I'm curious, not to just keep picking on you, but someone who literally has this in their title. What are your thoughts?
I mean, it's both, right? And I think, you need to run investment opportunities through your regular investment review process, but you have to build in cost of carbon into the future into that, right? And that's happening, right? So I think, it's when you can't have one or the other. You just can't, right? You got to still make money, and you've got to make sure that you're meeting the targets that you set over yourself. And some of the earlier opportunities are easy. It gets harder as you get going down the line, but I think the most important part is building the right architecture, and that's happening.
Chad, any final comments on that?
Only thing I'll add, those were great, was just I sort of observed that a lot of these, the biggest of these commitments, net zero and so on, by financial institutions are being made by institutional investors who, many of whom, pension funds and so on, have a long-term outlook, just by virtue of what they're there to do, which is protect the capital over the long term and so on. These are not day traders. So I think there'll be ups and downs of, of course, like there always is investment of money to be made and lost here and there. But I think what the big money, institutional money, is clearly signaling is that over the long term, it's not just that there isn't a sacrifice to be made here, it's that this is actually where the higher returns are going to be over the longer term. So even if in the short term we can come up with examples of how this is an issue and it will be an issue, I think over the long term the bet is that there's more money to be made as investors in this trajectory over the long term.
Yeah, very interesting to see where investors will be making their bets in the coming months after COP, et cetera. So I want to just quickly thank everyone for their time on the panel today. Really rich discussion. I'm hearing, and some things I'm taking away, be it renewables or hydrocarbons, it's going to be a game of differentiation. You know, right now, emissions is top of mind. It will probably be more than that going forward. A lot around the fact that we can do a lot to transform our existing assets that we have in hydrocarbon sectors, but it's going to require a lot of creativity. The key to that is really rethinking resources and putting people at the center of that, and how can we really truly unlock that expertise here. So thank you very much. This has been extremely excellent. I've learned a lot from everyone on the call today. Such a really great 360 vantage point on the question. And so I'm going to hand it over to Erin to say goodbye to everyone and thank everyone for their time.
I'm putting a bow on it. Thanks, Karen. We do have one poll question. So now that you've heard from the panelists, we're curious what the audience members think about this opportunity. So I think my colleague Emily will flash the poll and we'll be able to see the results as they come up. And as they do, I've captured one quote from each of the panelists. So Trevor says, investor preferences are already changing the ways oil and gas companies are thinking about their business, for example, in their strategy and corporate spending. Sandra Odendahl on the hydrocarbons existing in the future brought up first the idea of an invitation and creativity, which everybody nodded along with. It's not going to look the same as it does now, she says. Chad Park, status quo is not going to cut it, and this is where the higher returns are going to be in the long run. And Nicholas Parker, many, but my favorite, so I have to repeat it, is where the puck are we going? So thank you so much to all of our panelists. And on this poll question, on a scale of 1 to 5, to what degree do you feel there are opportunities to leverage oil and gas sector assets to create the future energy system? We have a majority in the 4-5 department, which is very hopeful. And I hope that we can do this. And I know that we can if we do it together. And so I want to thank everybody one more time, Chad, Sandra, Nicholas, Trevor, and Karen, and for everybody who was able to join us this afternoon. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you next time. Have a great rest of your day.